Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining our program, Tech in the City, Breaking the Social Media Prism. How to make our platforms less polarizing with author Chris Bale and Issie Lapowsky, senior reporter with Protocol. I'm Pam Troy. I'm the events assistant at Mechanics Institute. We are very pleased to co-sponsor our program and our Tech in the City series with Gray Area and the Goethe Institute. Mechanics Institute was founded in 1854 and is one of San Francisco's most vital literary and cultural centers in the heart of the city. Gray Area is a center for art and technology involved in artistic engagement in our changing digital society. The Goethe Institute promotes cultural exchange about German culture and holds classes, courses, programs, and events. This talk will be followed by a Q&A. Please hold questions until the end of the program. Tech in the City, Breaking the Social Media Prism by Chris Bale is available for sale at www.alexanderbook.com. In an era of increasing social isolation, platforms like Facebook and Twitter are among the most important tools we have to understand and interact with each other. Wherever you stand on the spectrum of user behavior and political opinion, he offers fresh solutions to counter political tribalism from the bottom up and the top down. Chris Bale is a professor of sociology and public policy at Duke University, where he directs the Polarization Lab. He is the author of Terrified: How Anti-Muslim Fringe Organizations Became Mainstream, Princeton Press. His website is www.polarizationlab.com. Issie Lapowsky is a senior reporter at Protocol, covering the intersection of technology, politics, and national affairs. Previously, she was a senior writer at Wired, where she covered the 2016 election and the Facebook beat in its aftermath. Prior to that, Issie worked as a staff writer for Inc. magazine, writing about small business and entrepreneurship. She has also worked as an on-air contributor for CBS News and taught a graduate-level course at New York University Center for Publishing on how tech giants have affected publishing.
All right, should I take it away, Pamela?
Yes.
All right. Thank you for everybody joining us at home. And Chris, welcome. Thank you for being here. This is, I think, going to be a great conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Issie. Thank you to Mechanics Institute. Thank you to Gray Area and to the Goethe Institute. This is really exciting. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a cheesy question. I usually don't ask about book titles, but I think that this one, it comes up a lot in the book, the idea that social media is a prism and not a mirror or not, some other analogy. You bring up that analogy a lot throughout the book. So I think that might set up the conversation well to talk about why you characterize social media as a prism.
Yeah, I think, one of the deepest sources of polarization today and social division online is how different we can be online and offline. And I think, everyone's experienced this, right? You see someone say something that they would never say in person online, and, that becomes kind of normalized. So, today, about 73% of tweets about politics are made by 6% of Twitter users. And those 6% of Twitter users have very extreme views. And so this idea of the social media prism is meant to kind of capture the tendency for social media to kind of refract, if you will, the most extreme parts of the continuum and kind of make moderation seem impossible or invisible.
Right. And it's not a direct reflection of what society looks like, but it is fragmented and distorted in some ways.
Exactly. I think, especially during the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, we want to kind of use social media as a mirror. We kind of want to use it to kind of take the pulse of the world around us because it's almost instinctual. It's like a human instinct to try to figure out what other people think of us. And social media has really, I think, though we might want it to be the public square for democracy, where we engage in rational debate about the issues of our day, it's really become, in my view, and according to the research I've done over the last 3 or 4 years, it's really about status and about identity. And I think, too often our debates slip back into this idea that, social media is really about convincing each other that we're right, when in reality, I think it's really more about like performing for each other and gaining social status.
Right. So what got you into this field of study of polarization to begin with?
You know, I've been fascinated by social conflict for a really long time. I grew up in the French Congo, where, you know, at a time when the country was in the midst of an awful civil war. And then at the same time, I grew up kind of at the height of the internet, you know. And so for my entire career, you know, I've been a professor now for about 10 or 12 years. I've been fascinated by, you know, how does technology drive social conflict? And, you know, more recently, I've been interested in kind of trying to bring science to bear to answer some of these questions. So, you know, we have so many people in this debate, tech leaders, politicians, but very little data. And so a lot of the effort of the Polarization Lab that I founded at Duke University is to try to bring data to bear to answer some of these questions. And what we found often surprised us.
So we're going to get to some of the experiments you guys have done, but setting it up, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions people have about the way social media contributes to polarization?
Yeah, I think, you know, we have three, dominant ideas that are, you know, all so seductive. And I would love for them to be true because, you know, they're convenient. They provide explanations of how out of control things have gotten, you know. So for example, maybe a good place to start is the idea of the echo chamber. You know, I think all of us have experienced, you know, how social media can allow us to surround ourselves with like-minded people and kind of insulate ourselves from people who don't share our views. And of course, you know, people are concerned that algorithms may reinforce that tendency, creating a kind of filter bubble. And so more and more, we can't see that there's two sides to every story. We fail to humanize or empathize with each other. And so, you know, about 4 years ago, it was right after the election of Trump. It was right after the Brexit referendum in the UK. And these were shocking developments to a lot of people. And, you know, I thought the idea of the echo chamber just explains this. You know, like I didn't, as someone who's liberal, who's kind of, social media feed leans left, like I didn't see that Trump was creating excitement because I was only seeing Obama voters, right? So we had the idea in 2017 to try to break people out of their echo chambers and see what would happen if we did that. Would they become more moderate?
Right. Okay. So let's talk about this experiment. You write about a number of experiments in the book, but one of them includes a situation where you paid people to essentially follow bots that were on the opposite side of the political spectrum after you had already, you know, gotten some sense of where their baseline was. And you wanted to study then how following those bots for a month would influence them. So what were you expecting to find from that experiment?
Yeah, I mean, you know, for decades, social scientists like me have thought that intergroup contact, bringing people together to have conversations across social divides, should make people less prejudiced, should make people more moderate. You know, this has been demonstrated all over the world in many different contexts. So one idea going into this was, yeah, you know, you break people out of their echo chambers, they should be able to, you know, understand each other and empathize with each other. The key question, though, of course, is like, is social media the right place for that to happen? You know, would you expect, you know, people to become more moderate when they encounter people who don't share their views? You know, like a thought experiment I like to give everyone is like, think about the last time you saw something that you know was from the other side, whichever side you're on. You know, how did it make you feel? And so, you know, a kind of rival idea would be that actually, you know, this might make things worse. And so when we went to do the experiment, we surveyed about 1,220 Republicans and Democrats who used Twitter. And this was all on Twitter, by the way. It's all in 2017. And we asked them a bunch of questions about things like climate change, racial discrimination, government, you know, regulation of the economy, all sorts of stuff. And then a week later, as you said, we invited half of them to follow these bots that we created. And, you know, normally when people think about bots, I think they think about misinformation campaigns and, you know, attempts to kind of divide people. But we were starting to realize back in 2017 that maybe bots could be used to do scientific research too. And so what we did is we told people, you know, hey, we're going to pay you up to $26 if you can correctly answer questions about an automated Twitter account that we'd like you to follow that will share 24 messages a day. Now, they didn't know that the bots were going to tweet about politics. They were only told that they were going to tweet 24 times a day. Then at the end of a month, we sent them the same survey and we looked at how their views changed. And though we really wanted to see that people would become more moderate, because that would, kind of dovetail with the story of the echo chamber, right? If we expose Democrats to Republicans, they should become a little more centrist and vice versa. Unfortunately, nobody in our study became more moderate, and most people became either a little bit more polarized or a lot more polarized, especially Republicans.
And what do you think explains that phenomenon?
I think we want, we want to think about social media as this kind of place where we go to get information, kind of update our views. And again, we think of it as the public square of democracy, where we're, having high-minded conversations about, the issues of our day. And yet, really, when you kind of take the pulse of social media for a minute, you realize that it's really not about that at all. And I think though some people certainly use social media that way and aspire to use social media in that way, I think most people use it for this more basic human purpose, which is to really figure out our identities. So, social scientists for a long time have known that, every day, each one of us kind of, wakes up and puts on a different kind of presentation of ourselves each day, maybe emphasizing something more or less, or talking in different ways in different groups of people. And then we're trained, this is a human instinct, neuroscientists will call this the social brain hypothesis, that we're constantly surveying our environment for cues about what's working with other people. What do we present that other people like? And then, of course, we tend to cultivate those identities, those presentations of ourselves that make us feel good about ourselves. And so we do this all the time, and we did this long before social media. But I think the really interesting questions are, how does social media change this kind of all too human thing that we all do? And I think it happens in two ways. The first is that we have unprecedented flexibility to present different versions of ourselves. So offline, I could never convince you that I'm a good dancer, because you meet me and you instantly realize I'm really awkward, and it's not plausible, right? But online, I could be anybody, right? I could change my my age, my race, my gender. I could be completely anonymous in theory on some platforms. So we have unprecedented flexibility to kind of experiment with our identities. And then we also have all these new tools to monitor what other people are thinking about us, things like follower counts, like buttons, right? And even though we might want to use these things to really understand what other people think about us, of course, these things they distort the social landscape, right? When we get a it might release some endorphins in our brain and make us feel good, but really, we're getting this strange feedback loop that I show in this book, Breaking the Social Media Prism, can kind of fuel status-seeking extremists, but also make moderates just totally disengage. And those are two twin problems that I think really explain why an attempt to take someone out of their echo chamber doesn't make them more moderate. It just puts them into this identity war that, we're all kind of fighting constantly on social media, and we're trying to figure out ways to make our side look good and the other side look bad. And so exposing yourself more to the other side only brings you further into the war.
And it's really interesting that you found that on Twitter too, because I think of Twitter as a platform where you're more likely to, because it's a public platform, you're following a lot of public figures, you're more likely to encounter non-like-minded people than on, say, Facebook, exactly, or Instagram, which is very private and personal. Exactly. You kind of feel like this is where my friends hang out. Yeah. Right. So you're right that on the one hand, it seems like a bit of a counterintuitive finding that people wouldn't become more moderate, because as you said, this is sort of the great hope that if we would just break people out of their echo chambers, we would become less polarized. But on the other, it does seem to make total sense, because in your experiment, you have people follow these bots for a month. But people's viewpoints are based on their entire lifetime of experiences and their family's experiences and how they were raised and their media diet, and all of that was still ongoing. So do you think that we can really write off the potential that exposing people to differing viewpoints on social media would have a moderating effect over time? What further research could be done on that?
Yeah, I do think there's a way to step out of our echo chambers in a productive way that would ultimately produce more social cohesion and more compromise. But to get there, I think we have to talk about something else that you just brought up, which I think is immensely important, which is we're kind of like treating people like they're abstract data points, and this is there's a kind of hubris around data science. A lot of scholars like me just like to scrape, a million tweets and then tell stories about, what's happening in people's lives. But you're absolutely right. Like, people are, deeply complex, and they're encountering this information from different perspectives and different media channels and all sorts of stuff. So one of the things that I wanted to do with this book was to really tell the story of the online versus the offline. And so to do that, and to really figure out why people were having this counterintuitive reaction, we did in-depth interviews with about 80 Republicans and Democrats. And so the book presents the stories of people as they're stepping outside their echo chambers, and tries to really fill in, how like what you see online is such a small part of the story. So I think you're absolutely right that like one of the main things we need to do is to step back from the kind of like data science hubris that I think, a lot of us, I myself have been guilty of, but really like try to see things from people's perspective. Try to, if we want to understand what motivates social media users, which is critical, we need to talk to them. We need to get in their mindset. And that's what I really tried to do with this book.
Mm-hmm. And right. So one of the stories that you tell is about a woman named Patty. And you describe her as basically an unenthusiastic Democrat, I believe. And you said that she went into the experiment, not very forceful viewpoints. She wasn't one to, toss around on Twitter. But after the month following the bots, she became increasingly more defensive and more likely to intervene. And the hypothesis you make is that the more that she saw her side attacked, even though she wasn't necessarily a strong defender of her side, the more she went on the attack. And so that made me wonder, is it really a matter of exposing people to other viewpoints that doesn't work? Or is it a matter of exposing people to extreme viewpoints that doesn't work, or attacks on their own party that doesn't work?
Exactly. Again, I think you put your finger on it. Like, one of the main things we discovered is people like Patty, who's, like you say, this like relatively apolitical person who seemed like on the face of it, even though she was a Democrat, that she might kind of be seduced by a kind of Trump style populism. She had, for example, anti-immigrant views. She lived in a region of the country that, we've all heard about where, manufacturing has left and like, times are tough, and she's really, not happy with the Democratic Party. But, we see in the course of this month and in talking to her after she followed the bot, that like, she was never focusing on the moderate posts of like a David Brooks, a center right, kind of Republican, or like a Steve Bullock, the centrist governor of Montana. No, like she was focusing on like Ted Cruz and the most polarizing parts of the continuum. So I think you're absolutely right. The extremists are a huge part of the reason why people backfire, because what we're being exposed to, and this is again a human tendency to focus on these extreme parts of the continuum, they're, by the way, amplified by social media for various reasons. That leads us to really get a dosage of identity rather than a dosage of information.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You definitely fixate on the one most offensive tweet that you encounter in a day rather than the many that were more benign.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you also tell the story of a researcher, and I don't want to mess up his name, Muzaffar Sharif.
Sharif, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sharif. And this was a researcher in the 70s who conducted a series of experiments to see essentially how easy it was to get children to hate each other, was my understanding of these experiments.
Yeah, not the most ethical stuff by today's standards, but a landmark and infamous study.
It was the 70s. Can you talk a little bit about these experiments and why they were relevant to the story you're telling today about social media?
Sure. So, as soon as we got clues that, it really wasn't about rational debate, right? It's clear as day, it's about identity. We really want to understand, like, where do identities come from, and, how do they guide our behavior? And then more importantly, how is social media changing our identities? And so, Muzaffar Sharif is this kind of interesting character who decides, he has this hypothesis. He grows up in Turkey, and Turkey was, during his childhood, embroiled in this very long conflict with Armenia, as many people listening will know. And he realizes like, how are the people who are so similar, have a very similar like food, culture, all sorts of similarities, how can they engage in like centuries of violence against each other? And he develops this hypothesis: all we need to be terrible to each other is a social category, an identity, however meaningless. And so what he tries to do is he takes these young boys who are all very similar, relatively, as kind of normal run-of-the-mill boys that he could find, and he simply separates them and gives them a name, like the Rattlers and the Eagles. And he says, okay, they did the normal kind of summer camp things that kids would do in summer camp. And then he brings them into contact with each other, and suddenly, even though the boys have not been told to compete against each other or do anything bad to each other, within days they're getting into fistfights and raiding each other's cabins and stealing personal items and all this kind of horrid stuff. And this launched this decades of studies that show that we are so motivated by our identities that however artificial, you can tell people that they like one kind of modern art versus another, and they will make decisions to improve the status of their in-group and denigrate the out-group. So this is like, it's just a human tendency. And I think the really interesting question is like, how is social media feeding into this? And of course, what's the antidote? It's having like an experience that clashes with some prejudice that emerges from these kind of fundamental distinctions between groups, right? Like, oh, the other side actually isn't as bad as I thought they were. And so, in person, sure, you can humanize someone. But the question is like, does the internet and specifically social media, and especially today's social media, is it doing that? And I think the answer is probably no, right?
That's right. And then it poses the challenge of you not being able to create those encounters that would sort of disprove your thesis about the other group.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And, the problem is, and the other thing is like, we're using social media to feed our identity. So like the other story that was just shocking from the research in this book was the story of this guy, Ray. So, we met this guy. He's kind of he claims to be like a centrist Republican, and he's, very polite, even deferential. He goes out of his way to say, oh, I'm not a racist. All these people on the internet are always getting in fights, and they're probably just, losers who live with their mother, right? And then, we go to look at his Twitter data. And one of the cool things about this research, I think, is that we were able to, triangulate. We could look at people from the perspective of Twitter. We talked to them, we surveyed them, and each of these data points came from different sources. And so we were able to, for example, triangulate the story. And what we discovered is this guy, Ray, far from being, a polite, civil, middle-aged man, was actually probably the biggest political troll I've ever seen on the internet in 10 years of studying, political extremism online. And, meme after meme of, the most reprehensible, like vile stuff, I can't even talk about. And so the question is like, why does he do that? What's this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing that he's doing every night? And to answer that question, we really had to go deep into his motivation, him and the many other kind of extremists that we studied and profiled in the book. And what we discovered is that, the reason that this guy Ray does this is because he's a social outcast in his real life. He's recently divorced. He actually lives with his mother. He was literally talking about himself in our interview with him, which was just, astounding. Like he's literally created two separate realities for himself. But because he's a social outcast in his real life, he works in a liberal area where people don't share his views. The kind of micro celebrity that he's been able to achieve from sharing this unspeakable stuff on Twitter is really actually profoundly important to him. He cares and checks, nightly, how many followers do I have? How many likes do I get? And they're really fulfilling, a sense of purpose for him, however terrible for the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. And did you get at those motivations based on inference, or were you directly asking him like, hey, dude, we checked out your Twitter. We know you're not just straight.
Scientifically, we didn't want to confront people with those differences, even though that probably would have generated some interesting insight. Like we really wanted to be able to see the people as they present themselves in different settings, right? So the key question was like, how do you present yourself to an interviewer versus the internet versus say, a anonymous survey. And that's where we learned in the anonymous survey that he actually is, a middle-aged man who lives with his mom, So, we didn't actually directly confront him. I think that would have, provoked a much different kind of interview, and maybe we wouldn't have gotten as much insight about like his motivations. But like certainly like studying him carefully online and off, I think this type of comparison we don't see enough. And so we just see the story of like, these extremists at the very end point. We don't understand the story, the motivations, which I think if we want to solve these problems are vital.
Right. I want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, you can drop them into the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So because we've been talking about, particularly trolls status seeking online as their motivation, we talk a lot about changing algorithms to surface less extreme content, but it makes me think, if so much of what people are seeking is the feedback, the likes and the engagement and the retweets or what have you, how much of an impact do you think it would have for all of that stuff to disappear and things just become like a static message board?
Yeah, no, you're asking exactly, I think, the right question. And to clarify, like, I'm not suggesting that all of us have the potential to become this guy Ray. In fact, he's the outlier. He's one of the small minority of people that makes up for the majority of political content on Twitter. The far more common story is relatively moderate people who are just completely invisible on social media. So the other story that really stuck with me from this research that I read about in the book is the story of this woman I call Sarah. And Sarah is a, conservative woman. She's, we began all of our interviews by asking people, so tell us about the last time you used social media. And she says, well, I was up late the other night and I was, I'd gotten my kids to sleep. And the NRA posted something about it's Americans' rights to own guns. And she's like, well, yeah, like my husband owns a gun and he's a responsible gun owner. She says something, fairly innocuous in the landscape of America's gun debate. And then she says within minutes, someone had looked at her Twitter feed, saw that she had kids and posted, I hope your kids find your gun and shoot you. And, unfortunately, this is the kind of story that is just all too common. And we saw this again and again in our research. And in fact, like the Pew Research Center recently published a report that said the number one reason people get harassed online is for expressing their political views. The problem is that, people like this woman, Sarah, actually are exactly the type of people who I think have the potential to move things back to the middle. So, for example, Sarah is, despite being conservative, she's half Jewish, half Puerto Rican. She's from New York City. Her father is a cop. She went to an Ivy League college. She reads The New Yorker, even if she doesn't agree with it all the time. And all these things give her a kind of really, I would say nuanced kind of, view on like really divisive issues like race and policing. But we're never, ever going to hear her talk about it online because experiences like the one with the trolls that I just mentioned made her completely disengage. And so, why does she disengage? Is because like, unlike this guy, Ray, who's getting all this, like, he's getting this feedback that is like vital for his sense of identity. For Sarah, this is like actually a liability. It's not like her kids are, she's getting threatened, her kids are getting threatened, but also like, just broadly talking about politics makes conversations with family uncomfortable and colleagues. And like, maybe you care that something you said on social media would come back to you at work. This is the much more common story that we saw again and again and again among this huge but largely invisible kind of more moderate majority. And so a lot of what I wanted to do in the book is, and this is why I use the metaphor of this prism, is that it's not that we're stuck in an echo chamber and seeing the same part of the type of people. It's that the people we're seeing are very different online and off, and that has terrible consequences for the rest of us and makes us all feel more polarized than I think we really are.
Mm-hmm. So do you think dialing back the feedback, both for Ray and for Sarah, would help the situation? Like, I know I think Instagram has experimented with allowing people to turn off comments, and I can't remember if it was Twitter was hiding likes. Is it Instagram's hiding likes?
Instagram,
They're
yeah.
all trying. Is any of that stuff working? Is there any evidence it's working?
Like in the case of Instagram, one of the key problems, and like this is a big problem, like there's a lot of research happening inside social media companies that just never get shared publicly. And so, what we would love to do to answer some of these questions is like, walk into Facebook and flip some switches to tweak some algorithms and really run experiments to figure this out. We can sort of simulate that offline, but it's like, it has a little, like, it's not very valid, it's probably not like it is in real life when you're like, doom scrolling all night or something like that. And so, there's kind of two options. One is like, we can wildly speculate, which is like, I think what we're doing right now. We can look at some like traces. So a recent study, for example, looked at web tracking data. This is where like, someone agrees to share with researchers like every single digital footprint that they make. And in an interesting study, some political scientists basically tracked how often people progress from like a moderate view to a more extreme view. And what they discovered was actually pretty surprising. If you kind of take the pulse of the public debate, you'd say it's the algorithms of the problem. Like the companies are profiting, and this is again a really neat, tidy explanation that kind of explains it all. But when we look at the data, this only seems to happen to probably well under 2% of people, and maybe as few as 1 in 100,000 people. Now, these are preliminary studies. We need a lot more research, I think. And, and I think above all, we need, more transparency from the platforms to really get to the bottom of it. But the upshot for me is that even if we could, change algorithms, like we would still be left with a supply of a polarizing behavior, right? People like Ray aren't just going to totally disengage, from social media, right? They're still, they may get less of the feedback, but they're still going to be providing the content. And I think, thinking about the human drivers of polarization is something that we haven't done enough of. And, I'm worried that if we focus too much on these popular ideas that have very little evidence, that we might really wind up not really moving the needle very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, because you point out in the book what you were just saying about the sort of limited research that shows the algorithms are really driving radicalization. But then I thought, okay, well, at the beginning of this book, I read about how Chris introduced people to opposing viewpoints and they became more extreme in their viewpoints. And so how can you square those two things, where over the course of just a 1-month experiment, you saw people becoming a little bit radicalized, based on how the algorithm was tweaked because they were following these bots.
So just to clarify, it's not quite the algorithm. Like these algorithms are using like very often deep learning to adapt to individual behavior, and they're customized to each individual. And so like the theory, my interpretation of the theory of how algorithms radicalize us is like, we're looking for these feedback pockets and then people get served more and more of one type of thing, right? Our intervention, in contrast, was exposing people to the full range of alternative viewpoints for a month. So we weren't like, turning up the dial of extremism. We were just exposing everyone to everything. So, if you were a Democrat, yeah, you might see a Trump tweet, but you'd also see Fox News, and you'd also see, the Heritage Foundation's tweets. And we were trying to approximate stepping out of the entire echo chamber. So I think the thing is like, it's a little bit different because we didn't respond to individual user behavior like an algorithm might, but we did expose them to countervailing information. And I do think there's ways to improve algorithms. I'm just suspect that the story is really going to be convincing Facebook to flip a switch to make us all less polarized. That's what I'm worried about. That's what I'm worried we're all counting on, and that's what I'm worried in the end, we might not be able to convince Facebook to do that. That's a whole separate set of issues. And boy, I wish we could get more access and especially get access to the data. But I'm just worried it's not going to move the needle.
Mm-hmm. I get that. So going back to Sarah's story and, how moderates end up getting muted. Obviously, there's one aspect of it, which is Sarah self-selecting out because she doesn't want to take the heat from, whoever's going to come after her, understandably so. But what role do you think that the platforms themselves play in muting moderates? Or do you think that they play a role at all? Is it all based on human self-selecting out, or is it some of it because of what's being amplified?
I think, like one thing I would say, when we survey the public about social media platforms, like nobody's happy, like nobody really likes Facebook, or really, like public dissatisfaction with the platforms is pervasive. Like when we ask people like, have you ever changed your mind based on something you've seen on social media? Like stunningly few people say yes, and yet we're all still using it. And so I think like there's this, fascinating paradox to my mind. It's like, if the answer were just like, let's all leave social media, that's kind of an easy out, and I, like many people, have taken a break from social media and tried, and experiment, and, we've done studies that have people take a break from social media. But the strange thing is like everybody always comes back. And so I think that's why like we need to think a lot about like what is the intrinsic need for what social media is giving us, and how is it catering to these kind of deep human instincts. And so yes, I do think platforms could make changes to make people like Sarah engage more. And one of the things I was really excited to present in this new book is this kind of new research that we've been doing in the Polarization lab. So, we like many researchers, were involved in like early kind of conversations with social media platforms. Oh, let's do this experiment here, there, and wherever. Then Cambridge Analytica happens, this, very infamous case where, academic research was kind of mimicked to produce, data that was, allegedly used in political campaigning and micro-targeting, right? And so all of a sudden, everything gets shut down. Facebook is just closed. Now, research is still happening. We're just not hearing about it anymore. But meanwhile, like the realization we were having is for these moderates, like, should we really be surprised that we wound up here? Like we've been content to accept platforms that were designed for these just banal or weird purposes of internet subcultures, like Harvard undergraduates ranking each other's physical attractiveness, or in the case of Instagram, like arranging alcohol-centric gatherings, like just like none of these platforms have design principles that are designed to serve democracy, right? They've had this chaotic ad hoc evolution. And so the research we really wanted to do was to say, like, what is the design principle of social media that will promote civility and decrease incivility? And you just can't do that experiment on Facebook or on Twitter. It just cuts, you want to do things like, like change core features of the platform, but like for many different reasons, you can't do that. Legal reasons, PR reasons, user experience reasons, like, platforms just won't let you do this. So we decided to create our own social media platform for scientific research. And in the book, I talk about one of the first few experiments that we did on that platform to try to ask this question: if we could redesign social media from scratch, how would we do it? And that's where I think we can like most move the needle on figuring out, like how could we build a platform that someone like Sarah would actually want to engage on?
Mm-hmm. So let's dive into that. I think it's called Discuss It was the platform.
Yeah, that's the lame name we gave it for this first study. And we wanted to give it a lame name because like if we called our platform, like the anti-echo chamber or something like that, right? Like only people who really wanted to change their minds would come. So we really wanted to simulate a broad range of the population trying a new social media platform. So yeah, we gave it this kind of generic name, Discuss It.
And the main element of it is anonymity, which really, for me, was shocking because as a tech reporter, I'm like, okay, I've seen what happens on Reddit. I covered Yik Yak back in the day,
right?
And all of them, and even Twitter, obviously. There's a reason people control on Twitter, and every other platform where people just make fake names. So why did anonymity work for Discuss It?
Yeah, and I'm laughing because like I was shocked too. So, we went into the study, we wanted to know like what kind of levers can we pull deep inside social media to change things and to maybe make it a less polarizing forum. And so, we knew that identity is this key driver, right? We have these identity preserving dynamics. We perform for other people. Social pressure is making us kind of perform identities that other people like. And so one of the interesting questions is like, okay, well, we know anonymity can be really bad. You just gave a lot of good examples. Yik Yak, this now defunct platform where people basically just harassed each other who are geographically near each other, right? Reddit, yes, some of the most objectionable content on the internet. On the other hand, Reddit has Changed My View, which is a subreddit that's fully anonymous, where people kind of state an opinion and then someone else comes along and they say, basically, change my mind. And then they're given deltas or kind of bonuses if they change someone's mind, so they'll say something like kind of like contrarian and then try to get convinced, right? And the theory was that, okay, on the one hand, anonymity allows us to escape social norms and maybe we'll be uncivil to each other because there's no consequences. On the other hand, escaping identity and public pressure to conform to our side could, in theory, allow us to maybe entertain ideas that we wouldn't really feel comfortable talking about on a public forum like Twitter. So like if you're a Democrat and you wanted to talk about race and policing and maybe you were nervous about defunding the police, but you would never say that because you fear the consequences from your side, right? Or if you're a Republican, something like voter fraud, like it's just so against the orthodoxy. And so what we did is we asked people a bunch of questions, all sorts of stuff about their political views. And then we asked them a bunch of questions about two very controversial topics, immigration and gun control. And then after that survey, we waited a little while and we invited half of them to, quote, test this new social media platform that's called Discuss It. And they were told they were going to chat anonymously with someone else. What they didn't know is that the invite code that we gave them to log on to our platform was pairing them with a member of the other party to talk about either immigration or gun control. We gave them kind of gender neutral names like Casey or Quinn to let them basically decide like, what to share. We didn't tell them, please be nice, or we didn't incentivize them in any way to say anything unpolarizing. And what we found, which was really, really surprising, is that people who used the anonymous chat app to talk about either gun control or immigration depolarized much more than people who didn't. And there's an interesting footnote too, which is that effect was even stronger for Republicans. So in our first study where we'd exposed people to the bots, we discovered that most people became more polarized, but Republicans especially became more polarized, like a lot more polarized. So interestingly, this other experiment suggests that the power of anonymity may be even stronger for Republicans, perhaps because they're also afraid of going against the orthodoxy about, issues like voter fraud when, it's so evident that there's so much extremism and radicalism, around that issue that's frankly scary for a lot of them.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. But then I see how it works in an experiment, and then I struggle to see how it can be applied to existing large platforms, because you add anonymity and maybe in this circumstance you get civility, but you lose the other parts of social media that are already not toxic, like sharing baby pictures and dog pictures. Yeah. Like if you're anonymous, then nobody cares. The whole point is to share it with your friends.
Right. Right.
Can you really overlay it on any of the platforms that we are living with today?
So I don't think that we are going to, I would never say like, let's make Facebook anonymous, for example. Why? Because we have to think about how the design of the platform incentivizes different types of behavior. So I think that we're seeing in social media a splintering of all kinds of social media, like every few months, like a new kind of social media comes along, right? Like right now it's Clubhouse, but before that it was TikTok, and before TikTok was Instagram, and Pinterest is for hobbies, and we have all LinkedIn is for employment, right? So why should we have our political discussions in the same place that we have our cute kid pictures and cat videos, right? Even though they're adorable, right? Maybe what we need is to recognize that actually most people don't want to talk about politics. When we look at the broad population, the overwhelming majority could care less about politics. And this has been shown, in broad strokes on a lot of different social media platforms, like, something like less than 6% of Facebook posts are about politics. So, like we shouldn't, I think, expect these platforms that are really designed for like sharing cute cat pictures to produce rational debate. Instead, we need to rethink how status, because status and identity are the driver of all this, in my view. We need to create platforms where you're rewarded for producing content that lots of different types of people appreciate. So this is where earlier, we were talking about algorithms and whether algorithms could make someone like Sarah more engaged. And I think the problem is for someone like Sarah, like tweeting out into the ether about gun control, like she knows she's not convincing anybody's mind. She's only going to piss off people on the other side or on her side. And there's just no status to be gained, right? There's only liability. So I'm imagining something more like, the example I give in the book is Stack Overflow, which is, of course, a lot of you will know is like a site where software coders can kind of answer each other's problems. And when you answer someone's problem correctly, you get kind of upvoted and you gain a status for, solving a problem. Now, would lots of people use this? Like, would the whole population suddenly use this anonymous platform I'm describing? Of course not. Like, But right now, most of the population doesn't want to engage in politics at all. What I think we need is a platform for people who can and will engage in productive conversations about politics, because we know that political opinions aren't like hypodermic needles that we can inject into the masses. Instead, there's opinion leader dynamics. Most of us like know someone who tends to influence our views, and that person is the really engaged person who I think could work for a platform like this.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that those people are already open to those views, maybe when they encounter them on an existing social network? Like, what I'm wondering is, does it really do us any good as a society trying to become less polarized if all the people who are open-minded about having discussions with people on the other side just go over there to have their conversations, and we keep battling each other in the main arena?
Well, I think if we move that conversation to another arena, the other platforms are going to be a much less entertaining place for trolls to play, right? Like if they can't antagonize the moderates who are trying to have serious conversations, which is like the whole point of trolling, in my view, then, we're changing the status incentives. And, that, you can kind of think of it as like quarantining, some of the extremism. We know, for example, that, echo chambers have actually kind of insulated us from some of the worst extremism in a weird counterintuitive way. So, one of the other popular ideas out there about how social media polarizes us is the idea that foreign misinformation campaigns have, divided America by pretending, Russian, for example, trolls pretending to be, Democrats or Republicans in order to antagonize each other, amplify divisive issues. And this is, again, super intuitive. I thought this explains a lot of polarization. We went to do a study where, working with Twitter and US intelligence, we were able to create an indicator of who had interacted with an account linked to the Russian Internet Research Agency in 2017 on Twitter. And what we were really just surprised to discover is that 6 or 7 outcomes, all sorts of different stuff about beliefs, attitudes towards the other party, engagement in politics, lots of different stuff. We couldn't see any significant effects of interacting with one of these accounts. And so again, it kind of throws a lot of these ideas, open to question, is it really just that Twitter and Facebook need to do a better job with misinformation? If it's all kind of quarantined in one echo chamber, which is, by the way, another thing we found in that study, that misinformation tends to circulate in these extreme groups. And that's maybe why it's not changing people's minds, because the people encountering with it already have such strong views that their minds can't be changed. So in a sense, I'm okay with the idea of quarantining, as long as it eventually allows, the people who are willing to have productive dialogue to have a place to play where trolls aren't incentivized to ruin it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, in a perfect world, I think that would be great. I just question whether, because people have these network effects with these larger platforms, whether that becomes like an additional other thing that they do, but they still see all the sort of vitriol on the main platform. We have a question from the audience, so I want to give them an opportunity to ask. Given a political objective undertaken by this research to reduce radical political perspectives, do you ever encounter mistrust from extremists? Does that affect your interpretation of your results? As a left of centrist, do you notice yourself treating or designing differently around so-called radical right or radical left?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good questions. I mean, I think, though, right now, we are very much focused on de-radicalizing people, but I actually think, like, in the landscape of interventions that might work, and when we scan the survey research on like what might work, the academic studies, like nothing we've done to de-radicalize people really seems to work very well or scale very well. And almost all the interventions that we talk about are about, this tiny fraction of, a sliver of all social media users who are obviously doing terrible things. And we can see how even a small number of people doing terrible things can have broad consequences, but nothing seems to be working. And we're pouring hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into things like content moderation, and which are important. And I'm not saying we should stop doing that. What I'm saying, though, is the research suggests that like tiny nudges to moderate people and some better design principles in social media probably have much more potential to boost moderation and to help correct the distortion of political conversation in the country right now by, in kind of tiny little nudging and incentives to boost moderation. The question about Republicans and Democrats, I think, is really interesting too. There's so much conversation about both sidesing, things right now. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. I would argue, though, that when we think about the other side, we tend to think about, Washington and elected officials, polarizing behavior among people who really don't represent most people. So, on the one hand, if you're on the left, it's reprehensible that, January 6th happened and then maybe you're upset and more people weren't condemning it, right? Or maybe you're upset about attacks on voting laws, perfectly reasonable objections. And like depolarization does not mean, compromise. It can mean there's some value, intrinsic value, I think, in, connecting outside of those high profile polarizing debates. And I think, the data that I'm waiting to see is like when we actually pull in the data and look at like actual, party differences, how many people really believe in their heart of hearts that there was voter fraud. My bet is that it's far fewer than we think. All that said, there is evidence that polarization is asymmetric. So if we look at voting behavior of Republicans, for example, we see that Republicans have taken much more polarizing positions in terms of how they vote in Congress than Democrats. If we look at our first experiment with the bots, it's true that Republicans became much more polarized when they were exposed to Democrats than the other way around. What we're still trying to figure out, I think, is like, how much of this was a historical period? Was this a reaction to Trump, or was, is this a generalizable thing? And this is very much an open question in the academic literature right now. We've got like neuroscientists working on it, political scientists working on it. And I don't think there's a clear consensus.
We have another question from the audience. You mentioned that there are two different identities, physical and digital. Would you say that the digital identity is invented or discovered? Does it just come out as a byproduct of sophisticated forms of telecommunication?
Interesting. I mean, one thing that really never ceases to amaze me, taking the long view for a minute, is how like technology always does this to us, right? I mean, if you read, Benedict Anderson, the great anthropologist on the printing press and its transformational effect on politics and our ability really to imagine ourselves beyond ourselves, that, which is fundamentally what technology does, and especially social media, right? Like the idea of a public is actually partly made possible by technology. And so I think like to that extent, it's yes, there's always a latent kind of sense of us, but like what's changed so much and what I think is so powerful is, that the us is like so, unknowable, like that, this guy, Ray, who I mentioned, the kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character, right? That discrepancy between the digital and physical self is just like profound. It's just shocking. But it also kind of makes sense because we're all kind of calibrating these two levels, right? For someone like Ray, like he's spending all these hours on Twitter making these disgusting memes because like that's where he's getting this human, this intrinsic sense of status. Whereas for this woman Sarah, it's exactly the other way around, right? Like she's getting nothing out of it, and so she's disengaging. So I think the answer about whether we're becoming or whether it's some kind of intrinsic state, it really depends on the person and their social position offline. So what we discovered is a lot of these extremists, think like we profile a liberal extremist in the book who is in a bright red part of the country. And, all of his friends from high school won't talk to him because, he won't stop criticizing Trump, and he can't get a date because he's, so anti-Trump. And he's like, he can't even get through a football game with his family because of, because politics comes up. And so really like it suggests to me that like the digital world is really like, creating a new, for better or worse, and often for worse, and probably usually for worse, this distorted sense of purpose and status that's really, disastrous for the rest of us.
We have another question from the audience. Has anyone looked at the effects of mediator style comments on de-escalating extremism on social media? Listening, repeating in words to build a relationship. Have relationships for discussion been built on social media?
There's been some interesting research done on Reddit. So we've been able to, for example, look at like positioning moderation norms, interventions where like a bot will essentially say like, hey, the norms on this subreddit are X, versus someone just coming onto the subreddit and using it. There is some evidence that can help. that we're all kind of like reading the situation, right? That like when we enter this, especially when we enter a new digital space, you know, like we don't know the norms, you know, we don't like, just like if you were like, you know, walking into the high school cafeteria, like, you know, where do I sit? What's going on, right? And then you start to get signals. So we do know that these kind of like strong cues can help, at least in the case of Reddit. One of the things that we're experimenting on with our platform now is how you bring the people in conversation with each other. So a lot of the research on offline interactions, which by the way, suggests that simple conversations, even 10 minutes between Republicans and Democrats in the US, can depolarize people to a surprising degree. You know, 10 points on a 0 to 100 scale in terms of attitude judgments from just 10 minutes. That's pretty significant. So the question is like, kind of why does that happen? And one of the suspected mechanisms is kind of perspective taking. You know, like if you hear someone talk about their story, you know, and it allows you to kind of, for a moment, you know, suspend your assumptions about the world and kind of see how, you know, like, yeah, maybe I don't agree with you, but I at least can see how you might think that given your story, right? Those are the kinds of things that we've seen have the potential to depolarize. But the tricky thing is like, how do you automate those things? You know, we're exploring things like nudges that would say like, can you tell your partner a story about how your views developed on this issue, you know, things like that. But, you know, certainly thinking about how to scale these things, and like, you know, it's hard to imagine, for example, you know, Facebook or Twitter, you know, having like a little, like, I guess, I don't know, maybe some of you are old enough to remember the little like paperclip in Microsoft Word that would have, you know, occasionally come on the screen and harass you. Like that probably wouldn't go down so well on Facebook and Twitter, I'm thinking. But these kind of, you know, subtle, nuanced interventions on Reddit, you know, really seem to work. Yeah, interesting study by J. Nathan Matthias.
Okay, very cool. We've got one other question. This is from Dorothea. We are afraid to share our point of view online because of the reaction of sorry, this just moved. Because of the people who have very extreme reactions. You kind of got to this a little bit, Chris, but how can we create a forum where we can share our opinions across different venues without fear of someone threatening our personal well-being?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, like, you know, we talked about the platform, we talked about all these other, and, you know, like, again, like, I'm not suggesting that like tomorrow this platform is going to spontaneously emerge and, you know, like all we need is goodwill, right? Like clearly we need multiple interventions at multiple levels of analysis. There's a role for the platforms to play. There's a role for a new kind of platform to come along. There's also us, and like, what can we do given the current situation? And that's where, like, you know, one of the last things that I do in this book is try to introduce new technology that people can actually use to overcome polarization. So if I can share my screen for a second here, I'll just take you all to polarizationlab.com, and I'm on our tools page here. And what these are a series of resources, apps, bots, quizzes that are research-based. So for example, this one here helps you identify extremists and avoid them based on like terms that they may use or characteristics of users. This one here is a social media bipartisanship leaderboard. So very often we're asked, you know, like, who's in the middle? Like, is there a middle, right? It can feel like there's no middle. So what we did is we used our linked survey data and various machine learning techniques to identify people who are getting traction on both sides. So there are large numbers of people, celebrities, journalists, you know, politicians, who actually do resonate across divides. So this is a leaderboard that's designed to actually create a kind of status around that, to create a status around moderation. Right now, you know, look what happens to the moderates. Like, you take the Republican Party, like Liz Cheney, Ben Sass, you know, like I realize these aren't like celebrities on the left, right? These are not like popular people, but look at what's happening to them on the right. Like, they're getting censured left and right, and there's like every incentive to conform and no incentive to moderate, right? So this is a proof of concept that, you know, like, what if Facebook and Twitter boosted us not based on engagement in general, which would primarily be engagement from our side, but what if our algorithms rewarded us for producing content that resonated with lots of different types of people? Here, the thought example is politics, but it could be race, it could be gender, it could be age. Like, that would almost optimize for democracy. And then we have other tools on here, like bots that retweet people from the bipartisanship leaderboard, tools that track hashtags, allowing you to hopefully find areas where we think there's room for compromise. measure your own Twitter account, see what other people see when they read your tweets in terms of how they might interpret your ideology. So the goal here is to, kind of empower social media users to be, one, to raise kind of awareness, but two, to try to even, embed some technology in our day-to-day life. Maybe it's something as simple as a bot that just like slightly tweaks what you're being exposed to. And instead of retweeting those extremists that our first study showed are, creating that identity threat reaction, these are instead, research tested cases where we know that people who are interacting with this content are liking it. So it's a way to try to make some of these, tips about how we can all contribute and how together all of our behavior contributes to this issue, to make it more of a habit.
Are we back?
Oh, sorry,
I think we are back. I don't know if the audience is back.
Oh no, okay.
Let's see. Gray area. Can you tell us, audience here? Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Chris, I don't know exactly where you cut off, but I actually had a question about the bipartisan leaderboard because I checked it today and a lot of the people on it were, you're right, Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, Ben Sass, a bunch of Republicans who have been critical of their own party and who Democrats recently have been, probably praising more than often typical, and Republicans have not been praising. So I wondered, when you are assessing who has engagement on both sides, are you able to see whether that engagement is positive? Because presumably a lot of the engagement from the right for those folks has been more negative than usual.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to politicians, that's the hardest case, right? Because these are people who are their neck is on the line on a vote in Congress the next day, right? Like, I think it's important to reward moderation in politicians, but I think it's even more important to reward it among, journalists, celebrities, other types of people who are opinion leaders who maybe, aren't as, clearly targeted by kind of current political moment. So, I think it does, it varies a lot. I understand that, maybe some people want to go on there and find like 10 new people they've never heard of, right? That like, oh, that's great. And, I encourage you to check out, I mean, Issie, I'm sure the journalists backwards and forwards, but maybe some of the other people on the call might not know, like a David French or a Stephen Hayes, if you are, a liberal looking for more, moderate Republican views, or, on the left side, like a Jamie Dupree, these aren't like household names, but they're really people who seem to have articulated a position that is working. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to like it. I think that's an important distinction here. Like, this is hard work to find common ground. Like, it doesn't mean, again, depolarization, I don't think needs to, require compromise. It's equal parts, understanding and de-escalation. But, we all have what I call in the book, drawing upon some research by Carolyn Shareff, a famous social psychologist, a latitude of acceptance. And the idea here is, if we expose ourselves to extreme stuff, like, it's only going to polarize us because like it's just too far removed and it makes it feel impossible to find compromise. But all of us have a range of viewpoints for which we will kind of at least agree to disagree or say that, like, I don't agree with that, but I can understand where someone's coming from. And so really what this attempt to do is to like try to keep us all within that latitude of acceptance and try to turn down the tenor of extremism, which is so clearly, when we're in an environment where 73% of tweets are coming from 6% of people, and those 6% of people have really strong views, we all snap back into this, like, oh my God, can you see what the other side said? It's ridiculous. I can't even engage with it, right? I think we all feel that way often. And so this is a kind of a way to try to, correct that distortion, to kind of try to break the social media prison.
Right. We have another question from Anand. He says, in the software world I live in, when I'm not tuned into Mechanics Institute programs, we have to perform root cause analysis once a crisis in the production environment has been mitigated or resolved. Every social media platform has its problems, but no root cause analysis of a crisis like January 6th can be taken seriously unless you address the asymmetric sources of disinformation between the polarized parties. How can a sane adult equate Fox News and every other so-called liberal mainstream media outlet? Have you considered doing a study of adults by media source?
Yes, and there's some really important work. Right now, one of the most exciting experiments I've been tracking is a study which is basically paying Fox News users to watch CNN for a while and vice versa. And like historically, you're right, Anand, that the Fox News viewers, for example, were more likely to believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction or harbored ISIS. All these things that we later learned are true. So, in the landscape of misinformation, it's absolutely true that, we're focusing on these like patently false claims that are actually, according to research, a very small part of the landscape. Something like probably less than 1 or 2% of social media users are actually engaging with that content more than once, according to studies from, the last 4 years. That's an emerging consensus in the field. But what's less appreciated is exactly what you're saying, Anand, that, the mass media is very often, circulating, in some cases, misinformation, but at the very least, misleading information. We can focus on something like Fox News, but a study that just came out this morning showed that Sinclair Broadcasting, which has shaped a conservative agenda in a lot of local news networks, also has a polarizing. People watch local news. One of my concerns is we're focused on this narrow little part of the like the equation, like foreign misinformation campaigns, algorithms, so on. When you say root causes, I 100% agree. But we can't first principles this. Like one thing that all social scientists know is that like human behavior is just enormously complex. There's no root fundamental evil. It's the way that we're interacting with the platforms. It's not that the platforms themselves are wrong. Could they be better? Yes. But like we're all interacting in this very emergent way, right? The way that we interact with something at one point changes the platform and changes us. And so trapping and figuring out those complex interactions, especially at scale, especially involving millions of people, is something that I don't think we can just say, there's one unique cause. Even if I, completely share your kind of anger about the scale and the asymmetry of misinformation, But I think the other thing we need to keep in mind is like, there aren't many other, media outlets on the right. I've long wondered, like, maybe the thing that would be more important than, anything else is seating like a moderate Republican cable channel. So I think, absolutely, those are the right questions to ask. Too often we're just saying, is social media polarizing us or not? The story of polarization goes way back to cable news in the 1980s. It probably even goes back to the fall of the Soviet Union and the kind of common thread that, held our own tensions at bay, or the way that, the Republican Party mobilized, Southern poor voters. There's a million, explanations. So, we really need to, I think, it's tempting to think that, there's one algorithm, there's one way, or there's one first principle that we can use from this. But I think like the sad and difficult truth is that, this is a fundamentally complex problem. It's going to take cooperation at all levels and a changing and evolving problem.
And we're up against our time, but I did want to end with one last question. I think one of the most surprising parts of the book, any book about polarization written in the year 2021, is that you write that actually a lot of the polarization we see is false polarization, and that actually we're not as polarized as we think we are looking at social media, that rates of partisanship are actually pretty stable. But when I read that, I thought, well, is that really what we mean when we talk about polarization? We're not really talking about what is our split of partisanship. We're talking about what is our antipathy toward the other party. And it seems like by a lot of measures, Pew has done research on this. It does appear that is growing. So let's, clarify here. Is polarization getting worse or not?
Yeah, we make a distinction between issue-based polarization and affective polarization, or attitudinal, like, what you think of the other side, independent of their ideas. And in the journal Science 2 months ago, I published a piece with a lot of other social scientists where we identified that for the first time ever, out-party animus has replaced in-group love. So you're absolutely right to see that this is the trend. This is the meaningful trend, and the one that concerns a lot of us, that affective polarization is on the rise. Now, the important question, I think, is that because of social media or not? Unfortunately, we know that trend began before, large scale social media usage. So tempting as it may be to say that social media explains it all away, I don't think that's the case. I think there was, negative campaigning in the early 90s. There were, attack ads, increasingly vicious attack ads, the uncivil, a lot of social forces creating incivility. So tempting as it may be to use that explanation, social media, I think like the question we need to ask is not like, does social media polarize us or not, but how could social media be reconfigured to help counter polarization? And there's a lot of different angles to that strategy that we need to consider. So I think, but you're right. I think that dehumanizing element. So we know not only that people are, less willing to say, for example, have friends over for dinner who don't share their political views, but we know that people are more and more willing, believe it or not, on both the left and the right, to endorse violence against people from the other party, to dehumanize them in really scary ways, to punish them for hypothetical rewards and survey experiments. So this is absolutely a big problem, and certainly I think it's fair to say social media isn't helping. But when we think about solutions, I think we need to do things on social media. We also need to recognize that this polarization didn't come out of nowhere.
Right. And we did get one more audience question at the buzzer.
Oh, great.
So let me ask that one.
Please, yeah.
How much of this desire for a public commons is a liberal elite dream that has never really existed in the United States? Even before social media, a majority of the US populace has not been educated or trained in how to discuss, debate, and listen. This is exacerbated by older media, which sells extremes, knee-jerk reactions, violence, and war. With the commoners' dreaded ivory tower and educated elite, who is emphasizing the training and creation of true discussion and debate platforms?
So civic education, you're absolutely right. It's pitifully bad right now. I mean, to the point where like 15% of American high school students are passing basic civics tests. So like, I absolutely agree that, we need more investment in this area, especially in the age of social media. We need to educate kids, I think, to see the social media prism, to recognize, how extremism and trolling can be corrosive, of course, but also to recognize that that is not a reflection of real life. And for people who grew up with social media, it's even more tempting to make social media into real life, right? It's almost a natural thing to do. And I think we'll continue to see those trends. To the question about, is it a liberal dream? I think it is. I think it is true that, a lot of the discourse in the media around polarization comes from the left. But the encouraging thing for me is that when we survey the American public and ask them, are they tired of conflict and do they want compromise? So many people say yes, that a recent book was titled The Age of Compromise in an era of political division. This is like, this is what people want. Now, they may not know what's going to go into compromise and how hard it is going to be to find compromise, but the appetite is there in the general public. So I think, we need to, again, move beyond the elite level. And one of the brilliant things about social media is it enables that kind of peer-to-peer contact. And so one of the things that we're doing in the lab right now, one of our newest efforts is to create a polarization pen pal network for young people to help them like find someone who's a non-elite, person, like a, just ordinary person like them who they can connect with, and at least, have some way of beginning to have some contact with the other side in an era where we are so geographically divided that a study that just came out of Harvard suggests that most Democrats and Republicans are living in areas of the country where they will almost never interact with someone from the other side. So the danger for me is not, well, let's all leave social media. It's like social media may be one of the last places, particularly where younger people can make this progress. So we need to help them do that. And I think, civics 2.0, to cite a cliche, like I think that's very much going to need to be part of the solution.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris. And thank you for everybody watching at home. I'm going to turn it back over to Pam to send us off.
Thanks again, everybody. Thank you, Issie, and thanks to the Mechanics Institute. Thanks to Gray Area. Thanks to the Goethe Institute. And I'd love to, continue the conversation online. And you can find all my contact info at polarizationlab.com. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris and Issie, for a really great conversation. And again, thanks to Gray Area and the Goethe Institute. And thanks to our audience for coming and engaging and asking a lot of good questions. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.